Welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all having a great day. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps more people find these conversations. For years, fans of Sister Wives have been pulled in by the big dramatic moments, the shouting matches, the emotional confessions, and, eventually, the explosive divorces. But beneath all that noise, there's been another storyline quietly unfolding, one that never fully got the attention it deserved. And now, it's time to say it plainly. Janelle and Kody Brown betrayed Meri in ways that deeply reshaped the Brown family long before Robyn ever entered the picture. When you look back at earlier seasons with fresh eyes, it becomes harder and harder to deny that Meri was slowly pushed aside, not just emotionally, but strategically, financially, and symbolically. It often started with decisions that were framed as practical or logical, but over time, those same decisions stripped Meri of power, security, and a true sense of belonging within the family. From the very beginning, Meri was labeled as the sensitive one, the jealous wife, the emotional roadblock to family harmony. And let's be honest, no one is saying Meri was perfect, but that label made it far too easy to ignore how often she was outvoted, sidelined, or flat out dismissed by the very people who claimed plural marriage was about fairness and shared sacrifice. This pattern shows up clearly in the land decisions and long-term planning pushed by Kody and strongly supported by Janelle. Again and again, Janelle aligned herself with Kody's vision for the future, even when that vision came directly at Meri's expense. Many fans point to Coyote Pass as the moment everything fell apart. But the betrayal started long before that. Think back to Meri's legal divorce from Kody. It was framed as a noble sacrifice for the good of the kids. In reality, it stripped Meri of her legal standing while giving Robyn stability, security, and influence. Robyn often takes the blame for what happened next. But it's impossible to ignore that Janelle, who prided herself on logic and fairness, stood quietly by as Meri lost her status, her voice, and eventually her seat at the table. All the while, Kody reassured everyone that nothing would really change, even as everything did. As the seasons went on, Meri's isolation became impossible to miss. Family meetings happened without her. Decisions were made before she had a chance to weigh in. Her opinions were treated like problems instead of contributions. Still, Janelle continued to describe herself as neutral, saying she just wanted to avoid drama, while benefiting from a system that increasingly favored her children's futures over Meri's. This was especially clear in property division, inheritance discussions, and long-term financial planning, where Meri's equal contributions were rarely met with equal consideration. The Las Vegas years offer another telling example. When Meri wanted a house comparable to the others, it was spun into a story about selfishness and excess. What often got left out was the simple truth: Meri earned her own money, contributed consistently, and wasn't asking for special treatment, just equality. Instead of standing up for Meri's right to real equality, Janelle often echoed Kody's frustration. She supported the idea that Meri should simply accept less because she had fewer children, a position that directly contradicts the emotional and marital equality that plural marriage is supposed to represent. Over and over again, the expectation was the same: Meri should make herself smaller so everyone else could be more comfortable. Janelle's brand of practical thinking fit neatly alongside Kody's authority, allowing decisions to be made quickly and with very little emotional pushback, even when those decisions caused lasting damage to the family bond. By the time the move to Flagstaff came around, the betrayal was no longer subtle. Meri was openly shut out of meaningful planning conversations. She was kept in the dark about property lines and future plans, and she was spoken about as if she already had one foot out the door. And still, Janelle rarely challenged Kody's dismissive tone. Instead, She focused on her own housing struggles and future goals, reinforcing a system that pushed Meri firmly to the bottom. What makes this betrayal especially painful to watch is the rewritten story that came afterward. Meri was criticized for pulling away, accused of giving up, and blamed for not trying hard enough, despite years of footage showing her attempts to reconnect, to communicate, and to reclaim her place in the family. Time and again, those efforts were met with coldness or outright rejection. Kody has since admitted that he no longer felt married to Meri. But that admission only highlights how long he benefited from her loyalty, her income, and her silence. And throughout it all, Janelle's cooperation helped maintain the image of family unity. Even now, as Meri rebuilds her life after the split and steps into independence, the lack of accountability from both Kody and Janelle is hard to ignore. Neither has fully acknowledged how their choices boxed Meri out, eroded her trust, and left her emotionally stranded in a family she helped build from the ground up. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this betrayal is how ordinary it became. Viewers were trained to accept Meri's marginalization as inevitable, justified, or simply her own fault. But in truth, it was the result of years of small decisions that slowly added up to one enormous act of rejection. As the family continues to fracture and evolve, more fans are finally revisiting these moments with clearer eyes, asking uncomfortable questions about loyalty, fairness, and who truly benefited from the Brown family structure. And when you ask those questions honestly, the answer becomes hard to deny. Meri gave more than she ever received, and Kody and Janelle, whether intentionally or not, built a future that no longer had room for her, while continuing to insist she was still welcome. That contradiction may be the deepest betrayal of all. The longer viewers sit with this uncomfortable truth, the clearer it becomes that this wasn't one bad decision or a single lapse in loyalty. It was a slow, steady unraveling that played out over decades, disguised as practicality, necessity, and what's best for the family. Those phrases were used again and again to justify sidelining the woman who emotionally anchored the Brown family from the very beginning. Because Meri wasn't just Kody's first wife, she was the foundation. She took the earliest emotional risks, endured loss in a system that tied a woman's worth to childbearing, and stayed loyal even as her place was chipped away season after season. She stayed, she tried, and she believed. Long after the structure around her had quietly decided it no longer needed her. What makes this betrayal cut so deeply is the role Janelle played in it. She entered the family later and often presented herself as the rational, fair-minded one. Yet she still benefited from, and quietly supported, a system that increasingly treated Meri as expendable. Meri's emotional needs were rarely seen as valid. Instead, they were labeled inconvenient, something to work around rather than something to care for. It's hard to ignore how often Kody and Janelle talked about Meri as if she were an obstacle to progress instead of a partner. Her discomfort was framed as resistance to change, not as a natural response to being left out of decisions that directly affected her life, her finances, and her future. That framing mattered, because once Meri was labeled the problem, pushing her aside felt justified, almost necessary. Over time, that story hardened. Meri became the family scapegoat, the woman whose pain always seemed poorly timed, and whose reactions were used as proof that she didn't belong, even when those reactions were sparked by being blindsided, dismissed, or ignored. Janelle's role can be minimized simply because she avoided open confrontation. In a family system like this, silence isn't neutral. It carries weight. By consistently backing Kody's authority while keeping emotional distance from Meri, Janelle helped create an environment where Meri's voice mattered less and less. Nowhere was that more obvious than in financial discussions, which often reveal where true loyalties lie. Meri's financial contributions were steady and significant. Yet when conversations turned to property, future plans, or long-term security, her needs were routinely pushed aside. The language of fairness was often used, but it somehow always resulted in Meri receiving less. Not because she gave less, but because she was seen as deserving less. The irony is painful, especially when you consider how much emotional support and stability she was expected to provide without complaint. Coyote Pass made this betrayal impossible to unsee. The land was sold as a shared dream, but in practice, it became a source of constant uncertainty for Meri. She was left waiting for answers, clarity, and reassurance that never really came. Meanwhile, Janelle planned her future there with confidence, openly advocating for her vision and her children's interests. Meri lingered on the edges, unsure whether she even had a place in the family's long-term story. What's especially telling is how Kody dismissed Meri during this time. Her questions were labeled negativity, while Janelle's emotional detachment was praised as pragmatism. Vulnerability was punished, distance was rewarded, and slowly, everyone was trained to see Meri's pain as the problem, instead of recognizing it as a warning sign. This dynamic didn't just wound Meri, it warped the family's moral compass. Loyalty became compliance. Disagreement became betrayal. That's a bitter twist, considering how often Meri herself was accused of not being loyal enough, despite clear evidence that she stayed long after the marriage had effectively ended in every way but name. Janelle's more recent reflections on independence and self-reliance only complicate the picture further. Today, she speaks openly about financial freedom and standing on her own. But for years, she supported a system that leaned heavily on Meri's income and commitment while offering her very little emotional return. That contradiction is hard to reconcile without admitting the truth. Meri's marginalization made it easier for others to move forward and even thrive while she was left behind. Even the much-talked-about catfishing incident takes on a very different meaning when you look at it through this lens. It's often held up as proof of Meri's disloyalty, but emotional neglect doesn't come out of nowhere. It doesn't excuse poor choices, but it does explain vulnerability. What's hard to ignore is how quickly Kody and Janelle use that moment to justify pulling even further away. Instead of seeing it as a desperate reach for connection from a woman who had been isolated for years, they treated it like a final verdict. Case closed. Rather than asking what drove Meri to look for affirmation elsewhere, the family largely used the scandal to free themselves of any responsibility. It became evidence that Meri was now officially other, still allowed around, but no longer worth investing in. As the seasons rolled on, her role quietly shifted from wife to occasional guest. Her relationships became more transactional. Her emotional labor went largely unrewarded, and yet she was still expected to show up, contribute financially, and remain loyal to a system that gave her very little in return. That double standard says everything about whose comfort truly mattered. Janelle's claim that she didn't want to choose sides starts to sound hollow when you look at how consistently she aligned with Kody's decisions. Choosing comfort over conflict is still a choice. And in this case, that choice meant allowing Meri to be slowly edged out of the family's future. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this story is how long it took Meri herself to fully see what was happening. Hope, especially long-held hope, is hard to let go of. For years, she believed that patience, loyalty, and self-sacrifice would eventually be rewarded. That if she just waited long enough, her place in the family would be restored. Kody and Janelle did very little to challenge that belief, even as their actions steadily contradicted their reassurances. So, when Meri finally chose to leave, the narrative quickly shifted. It was framed as her decision alone, conveniently overlooking the years of emotional abandonment that made staying impossible. And while Janelle has since expressed sympathy, Sympathy without accountability does very little to heal damage that took decades to inflict. Now, as more viewers revisit the early seasons, a clear pattern is emerging. People are noticing how often Meri was asked to bend, to compromise, to absorb discomfort for the sake of peace, while others were encouraged to assert their needs and plan confidently for the future. That clarity has opened up a much bigger conversation about power, gender roles, and emotional labor within plural marriage. Meri's experience has become a cautionary tale about what happens when equality exists more in theory than in practice. What's becoming impossible to ignore is just how structural this betrayal really was. This wasn't only about hurt feelings or broken trust. It was built into how decisions were made, how money was allocated, and how emotional worth was measured inside the Brown family. Meri's gradual erasure didn't happen quietly behind closed doors. It happened in plain sight, season after season, normalized through language that framed her exclusion as consequence instead of cruelty. Kody often talked about accountability and respect, even as he offered neither. And Janelle, by repeatedly validating his leadership style, helped reinforce a system that steadily stripped Meri of agency. One of the most revealing parts of all this is how Meri's loyalty was demanded long after it stopped being returned. She was expected to remain emotionally available, financially supportive, and symbolically committed to the family, while her own needs were routinely minimized, dismissed, or reframed as inconveniences. And that imbalance sits at the very heart of the story, long after the marriages themselves have unraveled. It created a one-way relationship that benefited everyone except Meri. And this didn't happen by accident. It was the natural outcome of a power structure that rewarded emotional distance and punished vulnerability. Janelle did well in that system because it fit her practical, no-nonsense outlook. Kody enforced it because it protected his authority without asking him to be emotionally accountable. Over time, Meri's pain faded into background noise, something to manage, not something to truly address. The family grew comfortable talking about her absence as if it were something she caused herself, even when she was still physically there. Emotional abandonment is much easier to justify when it's framed as someone else's failure to adjust. That framing reached its most damaging point when Kody openly admitted that he no longer considered himself married to Meri. It didn't land as shocking news so much as confirmation of what his behavior had been saying for years. And yet, even after that admission, Meri was still expected to carry the obligations of a wife, loyalty, financial support, and presence, without receiving any of the intimacy, partnership, or respect that role is supposed to include. That contradiction alone shows just how unequal the family dynamics had become. This is where Janelle's role becomes especially painful to examine. While she later expressed sympathy for Meri, she rarely challenged the system that created her suffering. Instead, she focused on her own independence and future security. On an individual level, that makes sense. But it can't be separated from the fact that her stability was built, in part, on a structure that marginalized Meri, especially during the years when Meri's income played a major role in keeping the family afloat. The financial side of this betrayal deserves much more attention than it usually gets. In the Brown family, money was never just about getting by. It was about control and influence. Meri's steady contributions gave her a legitimate stake, yet that stake was rarely honored. Decisions about property, investments, and long-term plans were often made without her meaningful input, reinforcing the idea that she was there to support the system, not participate in shaping it. And when it mattered most, that distinction made her practically invisible. Even as Janelle later positioned herself as a voice for fairness and transparency, the record shows she benefited from decision-making processes that left Meri confused and unsupported. Nowhere was this clearer than during the move to Flagstaff. when vague plans and unclear land divisions left Meri emotionally stranded while others moved ahead with confidence and purpose. This imbalance didn't stop at finances. It carried over into the emotional storytelling of the show itself. Meri's pain was often presented as repetitive or stagnant, while the growth of others was framed as empowering. Subtly, viewers were trained to see Meri's suffering as her inability to move on, rather than as a natural response to years of neglect. That framing shielded Kody and Janelle from accountability by shifting attention away from the system and onto Meri's reactions. The real irony is that Meri's so-called refusal to move on was fueled by promises that were made to her again and again. Promises that the family would heal, that relationships could be repaired, that her place was still secure. Those assurances kept her holding on long after the emotional reality had changed. And even if Kody and Janelle didn't consciously intend to keep her in that limbo, their unwillingness to be honest about their intentions allowed it to continue, benefiting them while costing Meri years of her life. Seen this way, the catfishing scandal stands out not as a justification for how Meri was treated, but as a symptom of deep emotional starvation. The family's quick move to label it a moral failure instead of a warning sign reveals how little interest there was in addressing the real issue. Because doing that would have meant confronting the fact that Kody and Janelle had withdrawn their support long before that scandal ever happened. Instead, that incident became a convenient turning point, a moment the family could point to as justification. It allowed them to look backward and recast Meri's long-standing marginalization as something she had earned, neatly absolving themselves of responsibility while reinforcing the same power dynamics that had been in place all along. From that moment on, Meri's role slipped even further to the edges. She was tolerated, but no longer truly included. Her contributions were accepted, but her needs were routinely overlooked. As later seasons unfolded and Janelle began voicing her own dissatisfaction with Kody, many viewers were quick to celebrate her awakening. And it was understandable. Her honesty felt refreshing. But that celebration often ignored a difficult truth. Meri had been living in emotional exile for years before that, without receiving the same validation or support. The contrast is striking. It raises uncomfortable questions about why Meri's pain was so easily dismissed, while similar struggles in others were treated as moments of growth and empowerment. Who gets to be seen as evolving, and who gets written off as the problem? That disparity becomes even clearer when you look at how the family talked about loyalty. Loyalty was frequently used to control Meri's behavior, while Kody's emotional neglect was excused or minimized. Obedience was framed as virtue. Self-advocacy was framed as betrayal. And whether intentionally or not, Janelle helped reinforce this dynamic by choosing harmony over honesty, even when that harmony came at Meri's expense. Taken together, these choices paint a picture of betrayal that is quiet but deeply damaging. There was no need for open cruelty. Indifference did the work just fine. There was an unspoken assumption that Meri would endure whatever was asked of her, without protest, for the good of the family. And the moment she pushed back, that resistance was used as proof that she no longer belonged.